Hello folks, I'm Alan Watt, and today it is April the 4th, 2007. As time marches on, and so does the preparation for the complete grand finale for the New World Order, and we see everything coming into place piece by piece the world over. We can see the ID card in European countries even being pushed through drama shows and soap operas, where the little boys are ready to leave home to go out somewhere, and the mother casually says to remember to take your ID cards with you. This is to get us all trained, all ready for this big totalitarian system that very powerful families and dynasties have helped bring into being with the aid of all their think tanks and the lesser psychopaths, those who wish they had the finances, but they're certainly well paid to bring all this to be. When I first, many moons ago, as they say amongst the Indians in Canada, many moons ago I read The Next Million Years by Charles Galton Darwin. When this book was hailed as a breakthrough by the biggest newspapers in Britain and across the world at the time, on behalf of the dominant minority, as they called themselves, or as the guardians, as Plato would call them, who were getting worried about all the masses of people, the lesser types, who were just breeding out of control and eventually would overtake the elite families. This is what they were worried about, and they came out with all kinds of suggestions in Darwin's books about how to contain this and how to even sterilize the public. This was a non-fiction book put out by a physicist in the 1950s. How to even effeminize the males by introducing estrogen into their diet somehow, or else through inoculations and various other ways. These fellows don't put out suggestions. It's almost a legality that they must tell, at least put out in publish form, their agenda. And it's true, then historians down the road can look back and say, well, the public didn't complain, they went along with this, they accepted this. This is how it works. Malthus, Galton Darwin, even Charles Darwin and his family, they're all psychopaths with the same psychopathic traits of power and dominance, the right to dominate others, the belief in their own superiority. And they spoke on behalf of even wealthier families above them. In fact, they were financed by them. And through science and the mysteries, as they called them, the higher Masonic institutions and Rosicrucian institutions, which are always split up into at least two sections, as all societies are. The exoteric for most of the followers and the esoteric for those who rule, very similar to the technique used in the Soviet regime, where you had the masses who believed that they were all communist. At least that's what the propaganda kept telling them. And you had the Politburo at the top, two sections. And even amongst the Politburo, there's another higher elite who know the real agenda. That's how all these major institutions work, whether it's East or West. Because the psychopaths, even if you have even a good idea or a good movement or whatever underway, they gravitate towards these movements like sharks to blood, sensing the possibility of inserting themselves, becoming leaders because they can be very charismatic, and thwarting it to their own aims. That is why in totalitarian regimes of the past, we often see those who helped them achieve their certain aims and goals being disposed of afterwards, because the lesser ones still believed in the initial cause. They didn't realize it was being taken over, or maybe they did realize it, and then they had to be gotten rid of. I remember reading a book on police infiltration of criminal gangs and biker gangs and such like years ago. And it was interesting to note that those that were chosen to infiltrate and dress like the bikers and look like the bikers and get along with them were born actors, and they had psychopathic traits, because psychopaths act through life. They observe other people. They don't understand why the other people have emotions the way they do, or even help each other with no possible benefit in return. A psychopath is egocentric, but however, they do realize that they must emulate the ordinary people, the normal people, which they do very, very well. Many of them, in fact, become actors and actresses. But they also use the same types to infiltrate gangs or organizations, and they have tests for them, tests for psychopathy. This is well published in even military declassified documents. They hired them to work on the nuclear missiles and to do the unlocking of all the different fail-safes in order to launch nuclear weaponry. That was admitted by the commanding officer at the Holy Loch in Scotland, the American base for submarines. He admitted that's the psychopathic type was chosen through tests, and they would do what they were told, and they would eventually launch when ordered to without qualms, because they had no normal emotion. The same type are used to infiltrate organizations of all kinds, and always have been. And they do it very well. But in one book I was reading years ago, this particular policeman eventually said that he became to like the bikers better than his own fraternity of police, because the bikers were more cohesive and they really helped each other out more so than the police did. Interesting. Today, you cannot start any organization up. It's been like that for 40 years, at least. You can't start one up and expect not to be infiltrated. That's why it's impossible to pull off any terrorist act in the world without prior knowledge. It's impossible. Every country is riddled with Secret Service and CIA and other Mossad, etc., plants all across the planet. So there are no surprises at the top. Pulling off a stunt to get an agenda underway is well documented by the tyrants, or for the tyrants of Rome, ancient Rome. It was a standard procedure. To get the public terrified, Lenin himself said terror must be used. It was the best tool to get the public to submit as you rush through this new system. And we're seeing it today across the planet. After 9/11, which was just the necessary kick-off point to get it really blowing, really going, the Y2K was a joke for the public, because the real year started in 2001. That's why Clark wrote the book 2001 in the 1960s. High Masonic. There are no coincidences. the Project for a New American Century, with its published agenda of American empire, was already published in the 90s and updated in the later 90s. And it all hinged on something happening on a Pearl Harbor scale to get it all underway. What a coincidence. And yet all the treaties had been signed because bureaucrats across the planet don't work very quickly. It takes years of preparation and standardizing their systems so that they can get everything launched at the same time. And yet after 9/11, my goodness, every country suddenly was going under the same types of martial law because it was all being written beforehand. And bureaucrats had been crossing the old planet for years in preparation for the next step of the new society, the new world order, as Mr. Bush Sr. called it publicly. We've watched the massive spraying overhead that's going on daily across the planet. People are coming down with tremendous bronchial problems. They're becoming stupefied in some areas. They're having memory loss. I've got reports from different places of hair loss, male and female, coming out in clumps. That's toxic level. And short-term memory problems. It's war on the public worldwide, but if you simply look at it from a controller's point of view, what they're doing is perfectly natural. A military operation on this scale where the war is on the public, which is supposed to go through massive crisis after crisis and emerge from this in a completely new system of ordered control with no freedoms whatsoever, it must be really dumbed down, and you would use every weapon in your arsenal to do it. That makes perfect sense. And every major media now has this great environmental program every night to tell you, my goodness, the world is just going to superheat, and we've got to stop burning everything, and mind you, you'll be able to burn things if you buy a license to do it. They're going for even the wood supplies across the planet. If you have more trees on your property, you would extra taxes until eventually you can't afford to live there anymore, because that's a fossil fuel and it's a resource, you see. And you once thought it was yours, but no, you've been taught the opposite. You've been taught the truth that belongs to the big boys, the United Nations, the front organization for the global elite. They've already introduced bans in some areas of North America on wood stoves. Other ones are sneaking it in with more resistance by licensing them first. That's generally the first step. You license first. Then you get an inspector, and then you pay massive fees for an inspector to look up your chimney and with his expert opinion tell you what you need to do, how much it's going to cost you, and so on. Aggravation, you see. Until you can't feed yourself, heat yourself. Probably they'll have SWAT teams eventually if you're caught stitching a button on a shirt. That'll be self-sufficiency. Or darning a sock. And I'm not kidding. We're going to see what will appear to be madness launched on the public. It already is in some particular areas. I get reports from all over the world, as I say. And the bizarre thing is, people are accepting, they're getting used to the armed black-clad ninja turtles with their machine guns at bus stations and subway stations and all of that stuff. The dream of every tyrant in history was to get his army, his totalitarian army, accepted by the conquered peoples. And all they had to do was to tell them they're there to help you and keep you safe. and they dress them in black. The colour of death. The executioner and the hood was always in black, because police forces have changed from being services to forces and enforcers. It will get worse before it gets better. But before anything happens at all in that direction, the people have to stop sticking their heads where the sun don't shine and speak out while they have a chance to speak, because shortly it will be forbidden, and shortly they will not be tolerating anyone saying anything which they say is anti-government. And anti-government means anything negative at all about the system. You have a huge population in North America who've been so brainwashed by their Christian leaders, and they all belong to the World Council of Churches. The chairman was Rockefeller himself. He started it up. I think he's vice chairman now. And they all take orders from that group, the WCC, or Wicca, you see. No coincidence there. And they're all waiting for Jesus to come, and they're all going to be happy and get new bodies, and they'll be changed in the twinkling of an eye. And I have no doubt they will when they have their brain chips, because then you see me, then you don't. You will be gone. And R2D2 will be there instead. That's the world they're bringing in. The New Agers are spellbound and gluttonous on all the masses of cheap books churned out on channeling, nirvana, past life experiences, UFOs, and it's endless, the perennial religion that they always bring up when they want big changes made. This has been done all times in history before, the same stuff. It doesn't fail, never fails. And it's been so good because they've ensured that all groups that started up, or were started up for them to follow, have taught them not to look at anything negative, anything unpleasant. Turn away, turn your back, and look at the positive things, the positive side of everything. Well, what a beautiful way to disarm the minds of people. Because when you're walking along a train track, you want your ears open so you can hear the train coming, you would think. Pretending it's not there won't help you. Last night, or at least last evening, that's April the 3rd, on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation radio. And you can find it at www.cbc.ca, radio shows. As It Happens is the name of and I call it a show because it was a show. You can find a little talk by Barbara Budd on terrorism. This is stuck between a play on Samson the terrorist, and two birds are now living in the Chernobyl area, which they call the nuclear separate. It's a nuclear family. That's the big Masonic joke. The nuclear age. The nuclear. Clear meaning you can see through all families. You've got all the data on them. And it's stuck between all this bizarre trivia, bad hair day stuff, and all that kind of stuff, to make it all surrealistic so that you get horror news mixed up with this trivia, which even ended with Keith Richards admitting to snorting his dad's ashes after cremation with coke. I mean, this is how they make it all bizarre, surrealistic, and tuck in something which should horrify us at the same time. No, not the ashes and the coke, or Keith Richard, but this story on terrorism tucked in there. Psychological warfare. And it was about the new laws that have come out in the US. No doubt they're coming out all over because they're all coordinated worldwide, to do with suspected terrorists who are now finding they cannot get a loan at a bank if you're on the list, a credit card. You might not be able to even withdraw money from a bank. You won't be able to get a pass or buy a ticket for a bus or a subway or a plane. You might not be able to move at all. It will eventually come down, we know, to food and everything else, which are the basics of life. But this is the start of the first steps towards this, so that you're on a list and you find suddenly you can't get anything that you really need to survive. You'd be blacklisted. It also mentioned that you could get interviewed for many jobs and they don't have to tell you why you're being turned down, because you're on a blacklist, you see. You'll think you're just the one person that's got all the bad luck in the world, and they don't have to tell you why you're getting turned down for employment, and you can't buy this and you can't buy that, and you can't get credit. This is the big stick starting to appear. And even this story is meant to terrify everyone. Not to get yourself on a name or a list. Not to get on a list of suspected terrorists by being good. Now, terrorism has now expanded to include so many other things. So many other things, as I knew it would. They always put these things on the book, very vague, and expand them once the public have yawned and started going back to chewing the grass. They get used to it, and then they expand it. I know a lady who went down, or tried to get down to Texas to see her relatives. She was held at the airport for a few hours, and eventually one of them told her, and they didn't have to tell her, why she wasn't getting on the plane. And he said, you were down as a financial terrorist, because she owed back taxes from years ago. This is where it's going. And these goons that are well paid, the new fraternities wearing the black outfits, the executioners, will do what they're told, even though they know darn well they're in the wrong. But they're the minor psychopaths, and we breed them too. They're in amongst us. And they're always on the lookout for a job with some power. The new ID cards will eventually be your bank cards too. Eventually they'll be the only means of using contracts to buy anything. It'll be all cashless, going through your card. No doubt they'll have penalties as well for lesser terrorist suspects, or just naughty boys and girls. You'll be on a yellow list or something like that. And they'll just give you a fine or a higher fee or a penalty, surcharge on every purchase. But we are on a roll to the worst tyranny this world has ever seen. And the people are being entertained to death as all this is being set up. Entertained to death. If everyone truly wanted to know why all these bizarre laws are being pushed even locally on them, on your water supply, on your septic supply, your sewage takeaway, your land itself, the land you sit on, your housing standards, all of the things which are being pushed now, and the fines that go along with it for not complying, massive fines on a daily basis, you'll find it all comes from the United Nations. The United Nations was set up to be a front for a global government, run by the same psychopathic families that have brought us to war for centuries with each other. They want total control of everything, which gives you independence, including growing your own vegetables, ultimately. Agenda 21 gives you the United Nations plan for the habitat areas, and there will be two types. There already are, in fact. These big cities will be the big slums, very overcrowded slums of the near future, if they get their way, for the bulk of the populace, and very expensive habitat areas with ultra-modern houses and solar heating, and parks are already made, and they're for sale for the very, very wealthy, who will ultimately eventually be the bureaucratic classes that serve the world system. This is all coming into being now. It's happening now. Your local council in every country gets its orders filtered down through its organizations, including its Freemasonic and Eastern Star organizations, as to what's politically correct, and they smell the wind and they know where to go with it, and that's why it's all happening worldwide at the same time. It's just the people who now must be trained to go along with the changes, and that's why you use terror and fear in all big changeovers to get the public to accept a vastly new way of living, which is always totalitarian for the bulk of the populace. There's nothing new in this except it's on a global scale, and perhaps the second part that's not new is the fact that for the first time the bulk of the population are oblivious as to what's really happening, what's really going on. There's never been a time in history where pretty well all media gives you your thoughts, gives you what you will think, your takes, your spin on items they present to you. In fact, they don't leave you with anything that you have to ponder and come to your own conclusion. It's all wrapped up and ready-made for you. That's where your conclusions come from the mainstream media. And it's packaged with bizarre, surrealistic stories all attached to horrific ones till nothing's real or important anymore. Psychological warfare techniques have been used for a long, long time. You can find information on Tavistock Institute, initially a mental hospital in London that was transformed into a psychiatric investigative type clinic where they had all the rights to test even brain implants on people, chip implants and wires they used in their brains. Aldous Huxley was a frequent visitor to observe this kind of phenomena. We've been trained for a long, long time with all the Pavlovian techniques of stimulus response and eventually conditioning. I can remember when cars first came out with the little buzzer for your seat belt. That was a stimulus, primitive stimulus. The trained rats the same way. When they heard a buzzer, they'd go and pull a little lever for their seat. That was the response to the sound. And the public were trained the same way to strap on their belt, and then the buzzer went off. And the light went off as well. This is using machines to train you the same way as rats are trained. And the public were oblivious to the science behind it. We are conditioned in many, many ways in behavioral science and by behavioral scientists, so that we ignore what should be self-evident. and we don't see things for what they really are, or where they're taking us. The world, as I say, is under tremendous changes. It took years to prepare the public. It took years of negotiations, planning, think tanks, cooperation between governments to bring a state of emergency, or even to get it all in the books so they could go into action at the same time. And 9/11 was just the stimulus to get it underway, the excuse to get it underway. We never had this during the Cold War. We never had the mass of ID cards and spying on everyone and all the data collection on every single person during the Cold War, and suddenly we have it now because the Muslims might attack us. Psychopathic systems, when they go to war, have two fronts always. One front is the enemy over there, there's always a they over there, who must conform to our way, which is the economic system that we use. And with the economic system, all culture must alter as well. In other words, when you take an economic system on, you take all the culture and all the law system that comes with it, because everything revolves around the economic system. That's taught in economics. And they also have an equal intensive war at home, because they mustn't lose their hold over the populace that's funding it all, the ordinary people. So they have to try and make sure they are in control at home at all times as they wage war abroad to push this system on everyone. Psychopaths dream. They dream of total control. It's an orgy for them of total control. It's the ultimate orgasm to imagine a world where they're in charge of everything, because they have a terrible fear of not being in charge. They are control freaks. Therefore they must have the data and the monitoring of every single individual, so that they can feel better at night and sleep well, knowing that everyone's being controlled. The psychopath, as I say, is a great actor. They will show emotion, even tears, when they're discussing something, but if they show tears, it's for a different purpose. There's something internal that gets to them, because they're really rationalizing along a different tract of thought than the public who perceive it. And they can show emotion. I watched a little documentary on McNamara, who was really in charge of at least at the beginning of the Vietnam War for the United States. And he rationalized every single part of the strategy to get at war with Vietnam. And he did show some tears at one time when he was talking about a graveyard and how Kennedy had talked about how peaceful it was, etc. And then eventually Kennedy was laid there. It's because psychopaths see themselves as being the hero. They idolize the heroes of the past, the big conquerors. They love statues. They love glorious words and epitaphs and stone. They all wish to get it. This is how they operate. And the cost in human lives is totally irrelevant to them. They could be told the death rate one day in a war of their own troops or others, and go off to a party at the same time. Winston Churchill did this all the time during World War II. And you should read the memoirs by his own personal secretary who tells you this. A psychopath has no problem because they don't feel empathy for other people. They're like a separate species. It's unfortunate, very unfortunate, that years ago, when some brave souls got into the investigative mode on this problem of psychopathy, they realized that the psychopath ran on almost pure instincts, with all the needs and wants exaggerated. The psychopath cannot tolerate frustration. They must get things done immediately. They want their way. And so they likened this to a part of the brain which is found in all mammals and cold-blooded animals. And one particular character said years ago, he said it's more like a crocodile. And it's the way it functions. A crocodile sees what it wants, it goes after what it wants, opens its mouth, it snaps its mouth, it swallows its victim. It runs on instinct. And then, of course, we have people running off with the story and printing up books on reptilian people and so on. And then you have all the New Agers following this, looking for walking reptiles. Totally confused. Totally confused. And yet they'd rather believe that than go and research the subject of the psychopath itself. The fascinating things will attract a good bulk of the populace. In all times this happens, especially the more afraid they become of what's happening around them, that which they sense more than understand. In times gone by, people ran to their religions for safety. They had revivals because there was nothing else left to help them. And so they always waited for a champion from out there to deliver them from their evil. And we've seen this over and over down through history. We saw it with the cargo people even. Good example. This is a term they gave to islanders in the Pacific during World War II, where America went in with the big money, the airstrips, the military machine, and brought food with them, and gizmos and gadgets and all these wonders which were like miracles to these people who lived in a very simple, natural way. When after the troops pulled out, a cult developed in different islands. They called them the cargo cult, where they thought if they prayed enough, these big birds in the sky would come back one day with all these goodies and food and pop and utensils. It's no different in Christianity, where they have their preachers reading Revelations, misinterpreting them, of course, because they don't really understand them, and telling them it's God's will. So they have a fatalism involved, where nothing will be done because it's God's will, and God's making these bad men do what they're doing. But don't worry, because in the end, we'll be saved. As I say, the New Agers are into denial. Be happy. Don't look at the negative. Many of them actually think it's going to be fantastic when they get their brain chip and they're all one big Borg. Yet they never even ask the question, who will be programming me? Because it certainly won't be the individual themselves. That's the kind of future we're looking at here. This is the future which has been discussed by heavily funded think tanks on behalf of the characters above, mainly who wear suits and ties, with their myriads of white-coated scientists behind them, and professional people, the world of experts, as Bertrand Russell hailed it to be. There have been psychologists and psychiatrists who who've written about this particular problem in various books, tentatively, because it's not too popular when you realize that you're being ruled by power-hungry people, and yet that's what we call success in this system. We're left to conclude the system itself is deviant and that it helps the deviants get to the top. It's almost purpose-made for them. Personally, I think it is. So these specialists think that they should be given special privilege to oversee those who are given office in public affairs, from the highest to the lowest. In other words, they would sort of vet them. I don't agree with this at all, because by their own theory, the psychopath will use every and all means in this system to get to the top, and that includes their own overseeing organization. It wouldn't take long. And many psychiatrists and psychologists have gone into the study themselves because how other people operate fascinates them. It's a great tool for them to use over other people. This information would have to be taught at school to everybody, so everyone would be on the lookout at all times for the up-and-coming psychopaths who could eventually rule over them. Again, I would have to say for myself, this whole system would have to change because it is purpose-made for the power-hungry, the forceful, and the devious. Those with no conscience get to the top. It's a magnet for them, the system with its power, its gaining and dominance through business battles, corporate battles and takeovers. This is their playing ground, their playing field. They run that system. We don't live in a humane system. We must have another way. I don't propose to tell you what it will be. I'm just here to tell you what is and show alternatives. Because everyone must choose for themselves where they want to go and what kind of society they would like. But they must educate themselves on the type of people who get to the top in this society. Psychopathy is famous for its inability to alter itself. It will always repeat the same techniques over and over, right down through history to the present and into the future. It cannot be satiated with saying, well, I've got enough. That's enough power for me. It's as I say, it's like blood to a shark. It's a frenzy for them. It doesn't get satisfied. Power and prestige and the worship of the lessers beneath them, which is unfortunately true. Those with less tend to worship those with most. Because the society tells us that those at the top are winners. That's what all the sports are about, to reinforce the winners and the losers. When we live in a system where money dominates, I can see no other way but the way we're going. Where people have so many tokens dished out at the end of the week or the month, and you're told that's your lot because this is your rank. And yet, most of it's taken away from you in taxation to make sure the big boy system stays in place and they can hire their massive armies and teams of professionals to play with your mind. Now, that's a slavery system. as Galton Darwin said, a more sophisticated form of slavery, he was all for it, of course. Professor Carroll Quigley, who wrote Tragedy and Hope, came out with the big clubs that run the world in his book. And not to expose them to ridicule, but he thought being part of some of those clubs, he would take the honours for publicising it to the world, because he thought the world was ready to accept the fact that their betters, basically, their intellectual superiors, were ruling them. He thought it was a natural state of affairs, and the public would accept that quite calmly. He was tremendously arrogant in his ivory tower, and he was all for the plans of these organizations to which he belonged. He was the official historian, as well as many other things, for the Council on Foreign Relations. He had access to their innermost records, and there's a lot more he certainly could have told the public, but he didn't. Egomania, worship by the people down below, power that's never satisfied, the need to go down in history as a mover and shaker, and ultimately to make everyone bend the knee worldwide and say, yes sir, 3 bags full sir, is the dream of the psychopath. And we must recognize it now, because they are in charge. They are going to use the terror techniques shortly. They have many new words. They're good at making up words to camouflage their actions. Like rendition is where they just kidnap people and throw them off to some other government where they can get tortured. While we watch the sports and the soap operas and the comedy shows and listen to trivia that's presented as news. Horror is already happening, has been happening now for some time. While we get entertained. Those who are growing up now, who are idealistic as most young people are, will have to face this. For those who are older and who understand it, I'm sick of the response, well, thank goodness the worst will happen when I'm dead. Well, maybe not, because it's speeding up pretty quickly. And what a way to throw off your own responsibility onto the next generation. It's disgusting. It's disgusting as a response. The reason we are now at this stage is because the previous generation had the same attitude when they had credit cards thrown at them, regardless of their credit rating, and they go on a binge and spending spree of debt, while the big boys played their games and spun their web across the planet, and everyone entertained themselves and gorged themselves on pastimes. And that's passing the buck. And what will they all do when the buck stops? And you've brought children into a world where they have no say as to what they want to do. And like every generation, they learn by doing. The mistakes they make too, it's their choice to do so. That's how you learn anything, is by making the mistakes, and they must be allowed to do all that. To be brought up in a world which is rigid, and experts will monitor you from cradle to grave like a specimen. It's not human. That's not human. And we cannot leave it on their shoulders. Also, the younger generations have had more inoculations than any other previous generation. Again, a warfare tactic, which makes perfect sense. You don't want a well-educated, bright population on the go when you're making drastic changes in society. These things were discussed a long time ago in warfare circles. We've watched the big corporations eradicate the ordinary farmers across the Americas and Canada by government rules and regulations and restrictions. Did the same with the fisheries. Now they're doing the same with New Zealand. Because, again, you cannot be independent for your survival in any way whatsoever. During World War II, Professor Banting, or Dr. Banting, the great hero that gave us insulin for diabetics, wrote about, because he worked for the bacterial warfare laboratories, his real job, about destroying the agriculture of Germany by various means, bacterium, viruses, etc. And even bees were discussed back then. What you're seeing with the bees all dying off, being necessary to fertilize crops, what you're seeing is warfare. Because the big agri-food businesses are to be left in charge of all food production. And they've been setting up their big shops, the big farms, in Latin America under the Free Trade Association and NAFTA. You also have all the cross-pollination now going on with modified crops and non-modified. Everything's been tampered with. And nothing will be a surprise when the statistics come in as to the effects of all of this stuff. I'm sure it's not a surprise at all to those who planned it. This is not a pleasant topic. I'd like to come on and talk about nice things, but there's lots of stations out there talking about nice things. I don't do a call-in show because although you can go on for hours per day that way because most of your callers do the talking, I have information which I think is of interest to people, is pretty vital at the moment. Because we are at a final stage of something which will not be very nice whatsoever. As one elderly lady in her 90s told me recently, who has woken up to all of this and sees us praying to, we'll go through hell before we see any light. And that is true. The dark days are coming. For those who are helping me with the sites, I really appreciate it. I've got more sites coming up in Europe, and that hopefully will be done by the end of this week. For those who have sent donations, I really appreciate that too. And I hope they keep coming, and not just when I'm on some big show. We are in the midst of the final stage of this, and we have to push on now while we can. And there's a lot of good people out there of all ages who understand what we're talking about, and rather than feel helpless, they're starting to get involved and speaking out to the right people. And the right people know it too. And we'll keep going as long as we can. For myself and Hamish the dog, it's good night, and may your God or your gods go with you.